in the late 1920s. The continent was still reeling from the aftermath of World War I. It was not merely an economic or political crisis. Above all, it was a crisis of direction. The certainties that had sustained Europe for centuries are beginning to crumble. Traditional hierarchies are losing their power. The ruling minorities are no longer unchallenged. At the same time, a new reality is taking hold. Cities are growing. Technology is advancing. Access to goods, information, and opportunities is expanding as never before. For the first time, large segments of the population are not only surviving, but living with a certain degree of comfort. In this new context, a different figure emerges, one defined not by their origin or social status, but by their way of being in the world. In 1929, the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset observed this phenomenon and decided to analyze it. His reflections, initially published in the press, would soon give rise to one of his most influential works, The Revolt of the Masses. In it, Ortega does not describe an ideology, nor does he describe a specific social class. He describes something more difficult to perceive, a type of person, a way of life that does not depend on what one has, but on what one demands of oneself, a way of life that, according to Ortega, is beginning to become dominant. The man will call him mass man.
There is one fact that, for better or worse, is the most important in European public life today. This fact is the rise of the masses to full social power. Since the masses, by definition, neither should nor can direct their own existence, much less govern society, this means that Europe is now suffering the most serious crisis that peoples, nations, and cultures can endure. This crisis has occurred more than once in history. Its nature and consequences are well known. Its name is also known. It is called the Rebellion of the Masses. To fully grasp this formidable phenomenon, we must, of course, avoid attributing an exclusively or primarily political meaning to words such as rebellion, masses, social power, and so on. Public life is not only political, but equally, and even more so, intellectual, moral, economic, and religious. It encompasses all collective practices and includes ways of dressing and ways of enjoying oneself. Perhaps the best way to approach this historical phenomenon is to refer to a visual experience, highlighting an aspect of our era that is visible to the naked eye. It is very simple to describe, though not to analyze. I call it the phenomenon of agglomeration, of crowding. What is it that we see, and why does it surprise us so much when we see it? We see the crowd as such, in possession of the places and tools created by civilization. As soon as we give it a moment's thought, we're surprised by our own surprise. After all, isn't that the ideal? The theater has seats to be filled, so that the house is full, and the same goes for train seats and hotel rooms. Yes, there's no doubt about it. But the fact is that none of these establishments or modes of transportation used to be full, and now they're overflowing. People eager to take advantage of them are left out. Although this may be logical and natural, we cannot ignore the fact that it did not happen before, but it does now. Therefore, there has been a change, an innovation, which justifies, at least at first, our surprise. The crowd has suddenly become visible. It has taken its place in society's most prominent positions. Before, if it existed at all, it went unnoticed. It occupied the background of the social stage. Now it has moved to the forefront. It is the main character. There are no longer any protagonists. There is only the chorus. The concept of a crowd is quantitative and visual. Let's translate this into sociological terminology without altering it. We then arrive at the concept of the social mass. Society is always a dynamic unity of two factors, minorities and masses.
Minorities are individuals or groups of individuals with special qualifications. The mass is the group of people without special qualifications. The term masses, therefore, should not be understood solely or primarily to refer to the working class. The mass is the average person. In this way, what was merely a quantity, the crowd, is transformed into a qualitative determination. It is the common quality. It is the social mass. It is man insofar as he does not differ from other men, but rather embodies a generic type. Strictly speaking, a crowd can be defined as a psychological phenomenon. We don't need to wait for individuals to gather in front of a single person to know whether or not it is a crowd. The masses are all those who do not judge themselves, for better or worse, on the basis of any special qualities, but who feel just like everyone else and yet do not feel distressed. Rather, they feel secure in knowing that they are just like everyone else. Imagine a humble man who, when trying to assess himself on the basis of special qualities, when asking himself if he has a talent for this or that, or if he excels in any particular area, realizes that he possesses no outstanding qualities. This man will feel mediocre and vulgar, inadequate, but he will not feel like a nobody. When we speak of select minorities, the usual vulgarity tends to distort the meaning of this expression, pretending to ignore that the select man is not the smug person who believes himself superior to others, but rather the one who demands more of himself than others do, even if he fails to meet those higher standards in his own life. And there is no doubt that the most radical distinction one can make among humankind is this. There are two kinds of people: those who demand a great deal of themselves and heap difficulties and duties upon themselves, and those who demand nothing special of themselves, but for whom living means simply being, at every moment, what they already are, without striving for self-improvement. Drifting buoys. Today we are witnessing the triumph of a hyper-democracy in which the masses act directly, without regard for the law, through material means and pressure, imposing their aspirations and tastes. It is wrong to interpret these new situations as if the masses had grown tired of politics and were entrusting its practice to special individuals. Quite the contrary. That is what used to happen. That was liberal democracy. The masses used to assume that, after all, despite all their flaws and shortcomings, the political elite understood public issues a little better than they did. Now, however, the masses believe they have the right to impose their coffee shop clichés and give them the force of law. I doubt there have been other periods in history when the mob has governed as directly as it does in our time. That's why I talk about hyper-democracy. The same is true in other spheres, especially in the intellectual sphere. Perhaps I am mistaken, but when a writer picks up his pen to write about a subject he has studied at length, he must assume that the average reader, who has never given the matter any thought, does not read his work to learn something from it, but rather to pass judgment on it, when it does not align with the clichés that the reader holds in his mind. If the individuals who make up the masses believed themselves to be especially gifted, we would have nothing more than a case of personal delusion, but not a sociological subversion. What characterizes the present moment is that the vulgar mind, knowing itself to be vulgar, has the audacity to assert the right of vulgarity and imposes it everywhere. As they say in America, being different is indecent. The masses sweep away everything that is different, distinguished, individual, qualified, and select. Anyone who isn't like everyone else, anyone who doesn't think like everyone else, runs the risk of being eliminated. And of course, that everyone isn't really everyone. Everyone used to be a complex mix of the masses and dissenting unique minorities. Now, everyone is just the masses. Ortega begins by debunking a common misconception. The masses are not a social class. They are neither poverty nor wealth. They are a way of being in the world. They are the collective of those who do not demand of themselves that they go beyond what is given. That is why anyone can be part of the masses. It does not depend on what one has, but on how one lives. Here a key concept emerges: the average man. This is not a statistical average, but rather a mindset. It is the man who does not seek to go beyond his current state, who does not feel the need to better himself, who lives within the limits of what he finds and considers it enough. The problem for Ortega is not that he resembles others. Every society needs common elements. The problem arises when what is common ceases to be a starting point and becomes a limitation. When it ceases to be a foundation and becomes a ceiling. Then uniqueness is no longer sought and is abandoned. The mass man is not someone who is incapable. He is someone who does not want to push himself any further. And that resignation is not experienced as a loss, but as peace of mind. Here lies one of the text's most profound points. The vulgar is not new. What is new is that it is no longer perceived as such. There should be no gap between who one is and who one thinks one should be. When that gap disappears, so does the demand, and with it, the possibility of growth. Then what Ortega calls the right to vulgarity emerges. It is no longer just a matter of living without demands. It is a matter of considering that this is enough, that nothing more is needed. At that point, what is different begins to make people uncomfortable. Not because it is worse, but because it demands attention. It demands effort. It demands thought. And the average person prefers what is immediate. Little by little, excellence ceases to be admired and begins to be viewed with suspicion. And so, little by little, the ordinary becomes the measure of everything. This is Ortega's central point. Not the fact that the masses exist, but that the masses become the criterion, the norm, the reference point. And when that happens, the individual ceases to be a model and begins to be a problem. Ortega wrote these words nearly a century ago, and yet they still ring true. We live in an age where almost everything is available, where access is immediate, where opinions are constantly being expressed. It has never been easier to participate. But perhaps that is why the demand for participation has become less visible. Not because it has disappeared, but because it is no longer always perceived as necessary. And then the question changes. It's no longer what we can do, but what we're willing to demand of ourselves. To what extent do we want to go beyond who we already are? Because perhaps the real risk isn't out there, but in something much closer to home. The ease with which we settle into complacency, stop challenging ourselves, and stop seeking something greater than ourselves. And then, almost without realizing it, we come to see the ordinary as enough. Perhaps the ultimate question isn't who the others are, but what place we occupy. Whether we live by inertia or by high standards. And that doesn't depend on the era. It depends on each person.
If you liked this video, subscribe and support the channel.